Greetings, this is Greg. Let's start off with a quick review of the previous video. Between the early 1900s and about 1940, we saw propellers go from fixed pitch to two-position pitch, then to variable pitch. Variable pitch props allowed the pilot to change the blade angles within a certain range using a control in the cockpit. These variable pitch props didn't last long because it wasn't a big step from there to add a governor to these types and make them into constant speed propellers. In other words, they added a governor to vary the pitch to keep the RPM set at the level selected by the pilot, within certain limitations, of course. The details of how all this works is in my previous video, and I'll put a link in the description. That brings us up to about 1939, and maybe as late as 1941. That's when nearly all the frontline US or British fighters were being equipped with constant speed props. Meanwhile, over in Germany, they were working on constant speed propellers of their own. It's very difficult to put exact dates on German technology from that era, but as near as I can tell, the first mass-produced constant speed propellers on German warplanes were Junkers hydraulic propellers, and they seemed to start showing up in 1938. These were used on Stukas, Ju-88s, Ju-188s, and Dornier 17s, and maybe some others. A wartime Allied report says that the Junkers constant speed prop configuration was designed for ease of mass production and was not of typical German precision. Thus, it was quite heavy, and that could be one reason it wasn't seen on their fighter planes. Another reason it probably wasn't seen on fighters is because, as with the U.S. Hamilton Standard Hydraulic or the U.S. Curtiss Electric props, the Junkers unit didn't allow for a gun to fire through the propeller hub. The Germans seemed almost obsessed with firing a gun through that hub. They set the 109 up that way from very early on, and nearly every 109 that fought in World War II had a cannon firing through the hub. The 109's cannon is mounted a lot farther back than most people think. The majority of it is in the cockpit between the pilot's legs and at about groin level. I imagine it's quite loud in there when you fire it. The German gunnery manual, Herido, makes clear comparisons between guns and women. This cartoon from the manual points out that they both go bang when you press their buttons. This page on targeting makes another clear comparison. German manuals are full of cartoons. If you're watching the public version of this, sorry I had to censor it, but hey, it's YouTube. Now, the US and British manuals were pretty boring by comparison, but generally have a lot more detail, so I guess they're not boring in a technical sense. For example, this British manual will sometimes kind of put you to sleep, but it has all the facts you need. The Panther tank manual makes it look like being a Panther crewman in World War II is just party time. I don't want to get sidetracked here. I may talk about the Panther another time, and that manual's a good resource, so for now, I'll put it in the Patreon section. You might enjoy it. It's quite good. Okay, where were we? Cannons. The 109 almost always had one firing through the propeller hub. The FW-190 didn't, at least not initially. That's because there was no way to do it with an air-cooled radial engine. The 190 Dora 9 has an inverted V12, but was a stopgap airplane. I think it's likely they wanted to fit a centerline cannon to it, but just didn't get to it because they were really rushing that plane into production. We do know that all subsequent fighters from Focke-Wulf, the D-11, D-12, and D-13 seen here, as well as the TA-152, all had cannons firing through the hub. These planes, at least for the most part, used the German VDM propeller. VDM stands for United German Metal Works, or whatever that is in German. Exact dates are hard to come by here, but it appears that the VDM variable pitch propeller, not the constant speed props. Okay, we're going to talk about that later, but the VDM variable pitch propeller showed up on the scene around 1935. It was used on 109s fairly early on, probably starting with some of the B models. Pictures and diagrams of this system are very scarce. Even information on it is scarce, at least in the English-speaking world, so bear with me here. This is a picture of an Aero Products propeller as used on the P-39 Airacobra. Notice the large central hole for the cannon and the way the gears have to be positioned around it. That makes this entire package larger than it otherwise would need to be. The VDM system in the 109 is a bit like this. However, it uses a worm gear instead of beveled gears to engage the beveled gears on the prop blades. On the back side of the prop, and again this is Aero Products, you will find the mechanism that turns the gears. In this case it's hydraulically driven, and on the VDM system it's electrical. Here is one of two diagrams I have for the VDM system. You can clearly see the worm gear drive, but I really don't know if this is the way all VDMs were set up or only this version. I don't even know if it's one worm gear per blade or if the blades are interconnected somehow. Here's another. This also shows the worm gear. There are three main things you should know about the VDM system so far. It's electrically driven. It has a large overall diameter because it has to surround the hollow prop shaft. And notice that the spinner can barely cover the prop hubs, and you're going to have a spinner for reasons that are going to become apparent. So most of all here, I want you to notice this thing is big. Moving on, this is a Dremel tool. Perhaps you have one. It's an electrical motor, and in this case it's driving a flexible shaft. This person's using it to grind the ports of an intake manifold, but the point is it's an electric motor driving a flexible shaft. Now if you were to take that motor and make it reversible and keep that shaft, you have pretty much exactly what drives the prop pitch controls on a 109. The 109 uses a reversible electric motor and a flexible shaft to drive the pitch changing mechanism. The motor is about the size of a starter motor on a typical automobile. The flexible shaft allows it to be mounted in a large variety of places. As long as there's space for it and you don't have to bend the shaft too much, it's going to fit in there. It's usually mounted to the engine, so it's in different spots on different planes. For example, a 109F with a DB601, it's going to be in one place, and then in a different spot on a 109K with a DB605. The motor is controlled by a switch, which on the early 109s is on the instrument panel. Here is a picture of a 109D cockpit. It is the only picture of a 109D cockpit I can find that's from the period. This is the prop pitch control. It's not located in a great position. However, they kept the switch there, inconvenient as it is for the pilot, through at least the early E models. This is a 109E3, which was captured by the British and had a variable pitch prop with the control switch on the instrument panel as mentioned in the British report. Anyway, so far we have 109s with a variable pitch prop which is manually controlled by a switch on the instrument panel. And this was the configuration used on the D models and at least up through the E3s, and it probably started with B models. These variable pitch props created considerable workload for the pilot. I explained all that in my previous video, which is why, as with the Spitfire and other fighters, they were changed to a constant speed unit pretty early in the war, and the Germans, of course, did the same thing. So far, for the German VDM variable pitch unit, we have several components: the pitch change mechanism, the reversible electric motor with flexible drive shaft, and the pilot control to manipulate it. And there's one more key component to this system. Now we need to talk about the prop pitch indicator and why it's there. The next couple images I took from one of Sheriff Simshak's videos. That's an excellent channel. and I'll put a link to this exact video in the description. He describes the usage of this thing pretty well. This is the cockpit of a 109F, which has a constant speed prop, so it's later than what we're talking about right now, but the pitch indicator is the same as the earlier variable pitch prop airplanes. As you can see, it looks a lot like a clock, but without numbers. The 12:30 position on the clock indicates minimum pitch, and as pitch increases, the clock runs backwards and vice versa. Why does this gauge exist? You don't see this in very many US or British aircraft. Well, I think the reason is because it makes it very easy to verify that the prop is in the correct position for takeoff. It also makes it easy to check for correct operation on the ground without even starting the engine. You can do that, of course, because it's electric. Once you're in the air, it's not going to be used as much as engine RPM for purposes of setting propeller pitch, because engine RPM is a better indication of whether you need to increase or decrease pitch, although the gauge would still have some minor amounts of usefulness. Now, at some point, they decided to make this system, the variable pitch system, into a constant speed system. And all they really had to do was put some sort of governor on there, as they already had an electric variable pitch prop. So that's what they did. Of course, it was a bit more complex than that, and they also linked into the throttle, but essentially it's just the old variable pitch system with a governor. They did not bother to install a propeller control lever to manipulate the governor like we discussed with Hamilton Standard or Curtiss Electric. Instead, the governor is controlled by the throttle lever. So advancing the throttle would not only increase manifold pressure, it would also set the governor to some higher RPM. Full throttle would give maximum manifold pressure, maximum RPM in most cases. As the throttle is pulled back, they both decrease. They didn't get it perfect throughout the entire range. In other words, for example, best fuel economy happened at a specific manifold pressure and RPM combo, like most airplanes. And the automatic pitch control, when rigged to the throttle, didn't allow for the ideal setting. So for maximum economy, pilots would use manual pitch control in the 109. Using manual pitch control on the 109 was exactly the same as using the previous variable pitch propeller, because it was essentially the same mechanism. Again, the constant speed prop was really just an upgraded variable pitch prop with a governor. Now, exactly when 109s got constant speed props is a bit of a mystery. As far as I can tell, no 109Ds, as in Delta or earlier, ever had a constant speed prop. If somebody can prove me wrong on that, I'd love to see it. All 109Fs, as in Foxtrot or Frederick, and later did have constant speed props. So the changeover happened somewhere in the E models. I have this translation of a November of 1940 German technical order saying that an automatic air screw, that means constant speed prop, had been introduced and was being retrofitted on 109s. It also mentions the thumb-activated switch for use during manual control. So we know that by November of 1940, they moved that pitch control switch from the instrument panel to the thumb-activated switch on the throttle, which is far superior. So we know they had that as well by that point. Now, from the pilot's perspective, the only change in the cockpit was a switch that changed things from automatic, aka constant speed prop control, to manual. Manual was simply the manually controlled variable pitch system that had been in use up to this point. Now, it's unclear if the conversions to the constant speed unit also added that thumb switch, or if it was already present in some 109s that only had variable pitch props. The history there is a little bit murky. Either way, every 109 cockpit that I have ever seen that has a constant speed prop has the thumb switch for use during manual pitch control. Most also have the prop pitch indicator that was probably more important during the era of variable pitch. Although I've seen some 109s, including the G10 at the U.S. Air Force Museum, that don't have the prop pitch indicator. So it's not clear to me if some of the planes were built without them or if there were post-war changes. I think the former is more likely. I think some of the planes were just not built with that indicator because it wasn't critical and they probably had supply shortages. Normally, the prop would be in automatic mode, but in the event of a system malfunction or battle damage, it could be put into manual, much like the Curtiss Electrics. As mentioned earlier, manual control could also help with range, at least on the 109E manuals. They may have got that fine-tuned more on the later ones. Now, starting with the E7 and possibly a little earlier, all 109s used this system, an electrically controlled constant speed prop with a backup control using an electric increase/decrease switch to manually adjust pitch. In terms of operation, it's quite similar to the US Curtiss Electric. This brings us to the big question of blade count. I get this question all the time. Why didn't the Germans use a 4-bladed prop on their late war fighters? And that's a complicated question, and that's why there's all this buildup to it. I want to start off by saying that this question assumes that 4-bladed props are always better, but that's not true. There is a school of thought which seems to be valid that fewer blades are more efficient. I went to Hartzell's website. They make good propellers, and they address this very question. They point out that 2-bladed props are more efficient. But efficiency doesn't move the airplane. That's an interesting statement, and it will probably make more sense as we move along. Here's a statement from Aero Toolbox. They make it clear that you need more blades to absorb more power, but increasing the number of blades actually makes the prop less efficient, which agrees with what we read from Hartzell. So I would describe that as the modern viewpoint. They also mention that a single-bladed prop is the most efficient type. That's because the more blades you have, the more you lose due to the vortexes at the tips. We kind of got into that in the previous video. Ideally, what you want is one single, very thin but infinitely long blade, but of course reality gets in the way of that plan. Now, there were single-bladed props in production, at least to some extent, at one time. These may have been better in theory as compared to a 2-bladed prop, but not once reality sets in. There are several problems. First, they have to be counterweighted. That counterweight is not only weight, it causes drag and adds no thrust. If the counterweight was shaped to add thrust, so it wouldn't be just a worthless weight out there, well then it wouldn't be a single-bladed prop anymore. Next, you need to keep the total blade area about the same as you had with the 2-bladed prop, or 3 or whatever you had before you're trying to make it a single blade. But if you make the single blade 2 or 3 times as long as the other, you're going to run into tip speed and or ground clearance problems. If you increase the chord instead, in other words, make the prop blade fatter, that itself decreases efficiency as explained in the previous video, so you're back to square one. Then you have the issue of an asymmetrical load being applied to the engine bearings. Engines weren't really made to take such loads, so there were concerns there. These props, and for some reason I don't fully understand, they cost several times that of a typical 2-bladed prop back in this early era when they were doing it. Yet due to the extra drag of the counterweights, they didn't really provide any measurable increase in performance. Thus, you spend twice as much on your prop and you go out and fly the airplane and you're not even sure if you gained, 2 miles an hour or whatnot. So these died out pretty quickly, and they've not made a comeback, and I doubt they will. Although sometimes you see a Piper Cub that appears to be flying around on a 1-bladed prop, and what actually is going on there's some videos of this on YouTube, is that somebody cut one blade off of a 2-bladed prop to do this as kind of a cool experiment, and I do think it's really cool, but that's not the same thing as a prop designed to have one blade in the first place. It's just a 2-bladed prop. They cut off a blade, added a counterweight. So it's not really the same thing. I've also seen a design for a stowable electric motor using a folded single-bladed prop for use on sailplanes. It's an effort to get a big reduction in space and weight, and then when your sailplane needs a motor, this thing unstows and it starts spinning, and there you go. But I haven't ever seen that work in reality. I don't know if that was just a design phase thing or what. Anyway, one-bladed prop. Neat idea, but not once you get hit in the head with the reality of trying to make it work in the real world. By the way, what is Helen adjusting here with that screwdriver? Moving on. Of course, the length of the propeller blade is a big factor in propeller design. Long, thin blades are ideal, but it's just not that simple, as you need a certain amount of blade area to absorb all that power. You can't just keep making the blades longer and longer. Plus, remember, you've got tip speed limitations and ground clearance and other things. And the propeller also has to have a certain amount of size just to be strong enough to handle the power. So there are a lot of factors here. Now, the ground clearance issue was a pretty big deal. That's the reason that you started to see four-bladed propellers as early as World War I. This wasn't usually done for performance. These planes had very low RPM engines, less than 400 horsepower in almost all cases, well within the ability of a two-bladed prop. They went with four blades because they could use shorter blades, thus increase the prop to ground clearance. In the case of the DH-4 seen here, the four-bladed prop allows for a decent amount of blade area and the use of very short stubby landing gear, reducing drag and increasing strength, all while retaining pretty decent prop clearance as compared with what you'd have with a two-blade. In other cases, as seen here, the four blades keep the blades away from the airplane itself. Now, propeller design is very complicated. I would describe it as wing design with extra complications thrown in, and the math involved is way above my level. I do basically low-level algebra and kind of stop there. Here's a NACA report from 1926. It discusses blade element theory, which I'll get to in a moment. The point I want to drive home, though, is that these people were doing all this sort of math without any sort of electronic calculators. There are symbols here I don't even recognize. Now, there are some aviation YouTubers that can burn through this kind of stuff. I don't know if it'd be popular enough to make a video on the math problems of propellers, but like I say, I do think there are people on YouTube that can do that. David Lednesser certainly comes to mind. I'm sure Millennium 7 could do it. That's a channel worth watching. I don't know if I've brought it up before. And Adam the Engineered, I'm almost certain can do all this stuff too. But again, this math is way beyond what I can do, so we're not going to be going over it. Thankfully, I don't think we need to. NACA put a lot of stuff in text to summarize all this stuff. So what is blade element theory? Blade element theory, well, let me back up a second. Let's look at the actual explanation from a NACA report, a different report, but nevertheless. Blade element theory states, and I'm paraphrasing here, that if all other factors are equal, more blades means that the prop can absorb more power and will be more efficient. More blades better. At first, that would seem to contradict what we saw from those modern sources earlier, but I don't think it does. Back to our 1926 report. This report makes it clear that blade element theory doesn't take certain real-world realities into account, like the fact that the blades interfere with each other when installed on a real propeller. It's also true that it doesn't take into account the extra hub drag you get with extra blades, although that's discussed in another report. So that brings us to this statement from the 1926 report. The way I see it, the author here is pointing out that because of the complexities of the subject, actual testing is needed to validate any calculations involving propellers. And based on the huge number of NACA tests and the amount of money they spent on doing propeller tests, I'm sure he was right. That brings us to NACA Report 698. I think this one is very important. It's from 1939, which means likely this is the one that was studied by teams designing the Corsair, the Thunderbolt, and other upcoming frontline fighters. Now there's a lot to unpack here just on this title page alone. Let's start with that word solidity because we need to know it. Here is a late war P-47. I can tell from here that's a Curtiss electric prop because of the round decals on the blades. Hamilton standards were more oval. So let's zoom in. Okay, now let's put a circle around the prop. The amount of area within the circle that's taken up by the blades is the solidity. So if we doubled the number of blades, or just doubled the width of the existing blades within the circle, the solidity would double. When comparing 3-bladed props to 4-bladed, it has to be done at equal solidities. Otherwise, you're comparing different sized props, not different blade numbers. While I'm here, let's take a look at a higher resolution picture of that prop blade. Notice that the inboard sections of the blades have a sort of cover on them. Those are propeller cuffs, and they are primarily there to aid in cooling. They were normally made from a hard rubber, like a hockey puck type material, and are correctly called cooling cuffs. These are much like the fan on the FW190A's engine. It performs the same function, only it's attached to the prop. These were very common on P-47s, especially later ones. You can also see these on many wartime P-51s. In the case of the P-51, they not only improve cooling, but also increase ram air pressure to the supercharger at low airspeeds, much like in the FW190A. Back to our NACA report. This one is from the Daniel Guggenheim lab at Stanford. The Guggenheims were a major player in the mining industry and thus very wealthy. Daniel's son Harry was a pilot and flew in World War I, although I don't think he was a combat pilot. I think he served in some other capacity. They became very active in funding and promoting aviation. A lot of the NACA reports were privately funded, which some might find surprising. Anyway, back then, Stanford was known for engineering, and one of the Guggenheim labs was built there. I don't know if it's still there today, but many of the others still exist, or at least the buildings still do. One of their big projects was in 1929, when they held the Guggenheim Safe Aircraft Contest. There was a $100,000 maximum prize, and there were all sorts of criteria for judging to determine what was the safest aircraft. These criteria included things like minimum takeoff distance, stability, and so on. And there was a point system involved to determine the winner. This is the aircraft that won the contest. It's the Curtiss Tanager. This plane from Handley Page took second place and was the only other plane to even remotely come close to meeting all the requirements of the competition. The Curtiss plane won by only 1 point. And that 1 point was based on a slight superiority in slow flight. However, the Curtiss plane was using Handley Page leading edge slots to enable it to do this. Curtiss never paid them any royalties, thus lawsuits ensued. Glenn Curtiss was no stranger to patent infringement or being sued for it. He had been sued by the Wright brothers 9 times, and Curtiss lost all 9 cases. He also sued the Wright brothers 3 times, and as you could probably guess, he lost all 3 of those cases. It's ironic that Curtiss and Wright eventually joined forces and formed Curtiss-Wright. Glenn Curtiss literally died as a result of an appendicitis that happened while he was in court fighting a lawsuit from a former business partner. That was in 1929. During World War II, Curtiss-Wright, the company, went on to build a large number of engines and propellers for the war effort, as well as some famous planes like the P-40. Back to our NACA report, they tested 2, 3, and 4-bladed props of equal solidity at various blade angles. Because of course you can't just check the prop at one blade angle because it's going to work, within a range, and one prop might be superior at fine pitch and another superior at coarse pitch. Anyway, they found that the advantages of the extra blades were largely offset by the extra hub drag. So they fitted spinners to reduce hub drag and sort of reduce that effect. Then, as predicted by blade element theory, they determined that 4-bladed props had the highest efficiency compared to 2 or 3-blade and could absorb the most power. So the next question is, well, how much better was the 4-bladed prop as compared to a 3-bladed unit? And the answer is not much. The the four-bladed prop was about 2% more efficient and could absorb about 4% more power. You might say, well, 4% more power, I'll take it. Well, first of all, if your existing three-bladed prop can already absorb that power just fine, it may not be worth going up to a four-bladed prop. I feel this statement from NACA summarizes this concept pretty well. When you factor in the extra complexity of the constant speed mechanism needed with more blades, it just might not be worth it. I'm hugely paraphrasing this report here, so I will include it in the Patreon folder, so if some of you guys want to peruse this stuff on your own, you'll be able to. But regarding this four-blade versus three-blade thing, not a huge amount of difference. There is some, yes, especially at high altitude, but think about this from the German standpoint. Their three-bladed prop can handle the power they have. If they increase it to four blades with the same solidity, then sure, it would be slightly more efficient, but that's about it. With the state of things in Germany in 1944, if you were in charge, would you have decided to hold up production and try to gain 2% more efficiency out of your prop? Probably not. I don't actually think, though, that's the main reason they stayed with the three-bladed design, but I do think it's a factor. So let's talk about the P-51 for a moment. The P-51A has an Allison engine and a three-bladed Curtiss electric prop. At low altitude, it has about the same amount of horsepower as the P-51B, which of course has a Merlin engine and a four-bladed Hamilton Standard prop. Yet, even with about the same amount of horsepower, a three-bladed P-51A is the faster of those two airplanes at low altitudes. Now, these are both aircraft that are running in the neighborhood of 1,400 horsepower. Now, I know there's no apples-to-apples comparison. It's never perfect, but this is pretty much as close as it gets for a comparison between three and four blades on a real airplane. So let's look at the P-51B chart. I'll add a line where it has 1,440 horsepower at 5,000 feet, exactly the same amount as the three-bladed P-51A at that altitude. And under those conditions, the P-51A is still about 15 miles per hour faster. Now, it may have some minor aerodynamic advantages, and they're, like I say, it's never apples to apples. But clearly, the four-bladed prop is not providing any really significant advantage here because the A model is still 15 miles per hour faster. Where the four-bladed props seemed to shine was at very high altitude, or later at very high power levels. The P-51B was intended to fly at higher altitudes, and thus it had a four-bladed prop. The same is true of the P-47 Thunderbolt. The Corsair and Hellcat had 2,000 horsepower in the early versions, and these early versions still had three-bladed props. They were naval fighters, of course, and so were typically going to be expected to be fighting at lower altitudes. Although when power went up, the later Dash 4 Corsair did get a four-bladed prop. The four-bladed prop Corsair had 2,450 horsepower, depending a little bit on exactly when you're looking at the plane in terms of time. But that 2,450, that's up from the original version's 2,000. So yes, more blade area was needed, and the only good way to do that was to add another blade. You couldn't make the prop much bigger in diameter on the Corsair. Now, with both of those airplanes, the early Corsair and the later Dash 4, running at 2,000 horsepower down at sea level, they appear to have about the same maximum speed. I say appear because there aren't many tests of the Dash 4 that I could use for a really apples-to-apples comparison there. So I guess my point is that I don't think a 1,455 horsepower 109 G6 is really going to benefit from a four-bladed prop, and if it does, it would be up at very high altitudes. Now, maybe the later 109s that had up around 1,800 or 2,000 horsepower, they might have had a little bit of a gain at high altitude, but I don't think it would have been worth the effort. Even the Focke-Wulf, their final fighter in the war, the TA-152, that's really designed almost entirely around the idea of high altitude fighting, and yet it still uses a three-bladed prop. Why is that? Well, I'm getting to that. One theory I'm hearing a lot is that the Germans kept the three-bladed prop due to the machine guns firing through the propeller disc. And at first, that kind of makes sense, but I don't think it's correct. First of all, if they went to a four-bladed prop and kept the same solidity, then the total amount of blade area in front of the guns is going to be the same. Furthermore, synchronizing to fire through four propeller blades is not a big deal. The P-63 King Cobra is set up that way. In fact, the Germans, even in World War I, had machine guns firing through four-bladed props on the Siemens Schuckert D4, as well as the D3, and there were some others. The FW-190A models and the Dora 9s have four guns firing through three prop blades, so synchronizing two guns to fire through four prop blades seems to me to be much less of a problem. The FW-190 Dora 13s have no machine guns firing through the propeller, just the two wing cannons, but they still have a three-bladed prop. The same is true of the TA-152. So clearly, adding a fourth blade shouldn't be an issue, since that would only require two guns to fire through the four blades, and we know they'd been doing that as far back as World War I. However, both the late Doras and the TA-152s have cannons firing through the prop hub like a typical 109, and I think that is the main reason they stuck with the three-bladed prop. You see, here's the problem. Again, this is the Aero Products prop, but the idea is the same. If you are going to add a fourth blade to this thing, you're going to have to do one of three things. You can make the prop hub bigger, or you could remove the cannon and use that space, or you could retool and redesign the entire mechanism using smaller parts. I don't think smaller parts were an option for the Germans at this point. Their industry was in really bad shape by 1944. Removing the central cannon would have freed up enough room, but I doubt that was seriously considered, as evidenced by the armament setup in all the jets, the 109s, the late Doras, and the TA-152s. The Germans loved that central cannon. That leaves us with making the prop hub bigger. Take a look again at that VDM constant speed setup. You remember that worm gear from earlier? Well, that worm gear alone means that you've got to make this thing bigger to add another blade. Remember this picture. That spinner barely covers the prop hub. There's no extra room there, and it's the same way on the Dora 13. So why not just make it bigger and use a bigger spinner? Let's look at this Finnish 109 G2, and you probably see the problem. That spinner is sized perfectly for the airplane. You make the spinner bigger, and you need a bigger plane to fill in the space behind it. So I just don't think it was an option on the 109 unless they wanted to get rid of that cannon. What about the Dora 13 and the TA-152? Well, I think it's the same basic problem. If you make the spinner bigger, that's going to block off the cooling air for the radiator and oil cooler. That means you would have to add coolers somewhere else to the airframe, which is probably going to cost you more than you're going to gain by adding a propeller blade to the prop. So we don't have a really great smoking gun here. No solid evidence about why the Germans stuck with the three-bladed prop on their late war fighters. I wish I could tell you that, I had the secret stash from Kurt Tank that explained why he did what he did. Well, we don't have that, but we do have a lot of factors we can see, and I think that all of these are factors the Germans would have been considering back during the war. I think they would have considered the possible gains with a four-bladed prop, but probably concluded it wasn't worth it for three main reasons. Chief among them, they wanted to keep that central cannon. They didn't want to retool for an all-new constant speed mechanism, and I'm not even sure they could have done it and still fit it onto their existing planes. Yes, the P-63 King Cobra has a four-bladed prop, machine guns firing through the propeller, and a 37mm cannon through the spinner, but it's a much bigger plane than a 109. There are other factors there, too. It had the might of U.S. industry behind it, and Aero Products, who made the propeller, really wasn't that busy anyway, because few planes used their props, the P-63, P-51K, Bearcat, and not much else. So they could focus on development of the prop for the P-63, and nobody was bombing them while they were doing it. Let's also remember that the P63 has a lot of extra room behind the spinner for mechanisms because it doesn't have an engine there, and that may have been a factor as well. In short, I can't think of any World War II fighter with a four-bladed constant speed prop that has a cannon firing through the spinner except the P63. So I don't think the Germans could have built a four-bladed constant speed prop and kept the central cannon. And even if they could have, it still makes more sense to me to increase the solidity of the three-bladed prop with big fat blades, which is exactly what they did. That way you can keep your central cannon, keep drag low, only take a very small hit in efficiency and thrust, and maybe no hit in thrust at all. And all of this without retooling and slowing down production. That's all for now. I hope everybody has a great day. I do want to thank my supporters, especially my Patreons. For you guys, I'm adding a new folder with the NACA reports I used in this video, as well as some others I read on topics that I didn't get to cover, like the contra-rotating six-blade props. I may do that another time. I'll also put that Panther tank manual in there and add some more 109 manuals. They're in German, but a lot of my supporters speak German. Please check out my Teespring store and buy a nice mug like the 109 mug. I have that one myself. It also has specs on the back, or the ever-popular PBY Catalina Black Cat mug. We have posters and other stuff as well. Anyhow, thanks a lot, and again, have a good day.